All right, we have our tail housing. This is the next assembly we're going to be putting together because we've got a few pieces to go into it. I've already pressed out the bushing out of the rear. The bushing was pretty damaged. It had gotten some pieces from the gears coming apart, gears breaking, pulled some of the pieces in, ruined the bushing. So I took the bushing out, pressed it out, and I pressed another new bushing in. And I just wanted to show you, this is what it looks like once we got it in place. And what I did was use the flat piece of aluminum to start the bushing, starts it really straight. And then once I get down and it's flush with the back of the tail housing, and I have a round piece of aluminum that I go down flush with the inside of the tail housing, makes a pretty neat assembly. So once we get the bushing in, I'm going to talk about the seal, but I'm going to wait till the very last to put the seal in, just to make sure that everything is good with our assembly and that we don't have to do anything taking the seal back out, ruining it, that might hurt us before we get this thing together. What I've done is white lithium grease around. There is supposed to be a spring on these seals that keeps the seal pulled down against the yoke and seal the grease from getting out of the transmission. So I put white lithium grease on the spring, and this keeps me from bumping the spring off, because a lot of times you may not have a press, may not have access to one, and you can put the aluminum piece on top of the seal and you can tap this thing into place without having to press it in. I like to use a press. I'm just used to that. However you want to do it. As long as you don't do damage to the seal, you're good. And then make sure on the inside of the seal that you put something on it once you get it in place. But we're going to wait about that until we get the rest of the assembly together. I think it'll make it a little bit easier. Right now we're going to put the shift cam in. The cam is the one that has the tapered pin, but we won't be putting the tapered pin in now until we get the tail housing onto the trans. So what we want to do is, the good thing about working off a good clean table and an area around you is to keep parts hemmed up, because things have a tendency of dropping to the floor. So I've got my yellow reverse spring. I had my little cup with all the parts in it. It goes down into that hole right there. Then I'm going to put some of the white lithium grease onto the ball, the check ball, because this enables me to catch this thing a lot of times before it rolls off. And these are a little bit aggravating, not only getting in, but to get the shift cam in. And I've oiled up the shaft and I've oiled up the housing. And what I do is slide that in. I use a flat screwdriver, and I come in from the bottom side. That would be the top side. And I push down on that as I'm pushing the cam back into place. That time didn't work. You just have to have a little bit of patience putting these detents in. Sometimes they want to go, sometimes they don't. This one doesn't obviously want to go. There we go. Detent ball down, spring, and then the shift cam. And the shift cam is exposed out here, and we have an O-ring to go right here and we will put it on right before we get ready to assemble this thing. We also have an area here that takes a thrust washer with a little tab. We'll be doing that before we do the final assembly. And then we have our shift fork, and it goes down into the shift cam, and this is what will contain, that's what will catch the flange once we do our final assembly, because we don't want to put this on. We have a mid plate to put on before we can put this on, but this is where this will go. Then the shift cam will tap in and catch the flange on the back just like this as we assemble. And then once we get that in, tap the cam in, then we can put our O-ring on and tap it in and put the taper pin in. And I'm going to go now and press the seal in, and that will complete our assembly of the tail housing. All right, before I press my seal in, I want to make sure that my bushing is straight and my bushing doesn't have any burrs or anything that would keep the yoke from going in. I have a new yoke here, and it is the yoke that fits this particular tail housing. It slides into place. It has free play. It's not too loose, not too tight, but it does slide out and in, because at this point in time, if you did any damage to the bushing, you want to know it now before you put the seal in. Right now we're going to go ahead and put the seal in. What I do is put a little bit of silicone on this. It's up to you whether you want to do that or not. They usually have enough sealer around the seals to where you don't do this, but I got into the habit of this years ago, and I guess I just can't get out of the habit. So now I'm just going to use a flat piece of aluminum. And you want to be careful that you don't press this in. Once it bottoms out, you want to stop, because you don't want to do damage to the seal or the tail housing. So now we've got our seal in place, bushings installed, shift cams installed. All we need to do now is put our O-ring on, put our fork on the inside, and then we'll be ready to install our tail housing. This is the time I like to just stop and do a little reflecting on where we're at, because right now is where, to me, it gets a little bit complicated when you get to this point, because we're going to start gluing the side of the case on. We've got a mid plate to put on, then a tail housing to put on, and all of this has to have, you need to work through kind of a sequence in your head and have everything laid out. Everything is clean. I'm going to have to replace this reverse idler gear. It's chewed on pretty good, and I've got a new one to replace it. So I'll be doing that in the assembly, but getting my pieces down to where that all the pieces that I need are right here. And the first order of business in my mind right now, as I get this thing ready to finalize, is, like I say, right now is the hurry part, because you don't want the silicone to dry before you get to assembling this thing. And this is one gasket of two gaskets in this assembly. It has a gasket between the mid plate and the tail housing that may or may not be available. You might be able to get one, you might not. If it's not available, you can silicone the tail housing on. I don't see anything wrong with that, but we're going to work through a little bit of that, and we'll deal with it as we get there. But the next step would be to clean all this off with lacquer thinner and a clean rag, clean clean your sides, clean the plate, clean the tail housing, get everything ready when you open that tube of silicone and you get ready to put it on, that you're ready. You've got your wrenches or sockets and stuff laid out to where that you can get this thing together relatively quickly. I know the silicone won't exactly dry right off, but it is good to go ahead as wet as it is to get it on and get it bolted up, get it secure, because the next step would be to silicone the hives and put the hive together. All right, once the hive is together, I still like to check along and make sure everything is still free and working the way it should. It's in neutral right now, so I can spin it either way. But at this point in time, you want to have your tools laid out. You want to have all your bolts and washers clean. Then that way you can put them on, get them snug, and look up your torque specs to make sure that you know what the torque specs are for the bolts, because you don't want to over tighten these. Once you get the sides sealed on, then you can come to the rear, because this mid plate has to go on. And it's a little bit tight getting on, so you'll have to work it into place. Once you work it into place, then you can put your reverse idler, because you've got a thrust washer that goes on each side of this idler. One will go here in the mid plate, one will go into the tail housing, and you want to make sure that you use Vaseline or white lithium grease to hold that thrust washer in place, because it's got a tab on it, and the tab needs to fall into the little pocket that's in there in the mid plate and in the tail housing where that little tab is supposed to go, because that keeps this from turning. Then you can load your gear. Then you can put your reverse gear on, because it has to go on before you can put the tail housing on. So there's a sequence here that you've got to get in your mind, get straight. And we've got our snap rings, and our speedometer gear has to go on after our slider gear. Once that's into place, then we make sure our thrust washer is in the tail housing. And then we want to put lube around the rear of the bushing and the seal before we put this assembly. It's all wiped off and clean. And what I normally do is silicone the gasket. I just like to be extremely cautious, and then silicone the tail housing and work it into place. Then we have to put our reverse fork into play here, where this slides, where the shift cam slides over and engages our fork into the flange here on the reverse. So it'll be coming in like this, since we've got it on its side, and that's why I like to do this, because what it does, it allows this to fall down to where we can get the tail housing loose from this. But we've got to make sure when we put the tail housing back on that it engages this little fork before we put our taper pin back, after we knock our shift cam back into position where it's supposed to go. So just wanted to let you know there's a sequence to this, and we're going to do a little bit more, but right now it's just a time to make sure that you've got everything. Take a double look, make sure everything is the way you want it laid out. You've got everything ready, and that's what I'm going to do, is take a good look at this thing and make sure everything is by spec the way it should be, and then I can finish my assembly. All right, you should have had time to think about your trans, make sure you had all the parts and pieces in. I've already lacquer thinnered off a clean rag, lacquer thinner. I've cleaned off all my surfaces. I'm getting ready to silicone the hive together. We'll do that right now. I have Permatex gasket maker. It is a gear oil formula, and works real good on the transmissions and rear ends where you have a little bit heavier fluid. And you can do this, whatever your preference is on siliconing. You can do whatever you want to do. Main thing I like to do is just make sure that I've got enough on there to seal these things up and not have any oil leaks when you get done. I've got my silicone on both hives. It's just a habit that I do. You can do whatever you want. If you want to put it on one hive, I just put it on both hives because I make sure I don't miss anything when I do. And make sure you get the little spot on the end, this end on the front, on both sides of the case. You don't have to do it on the back, even though I do, but you don't have to do it on the back because the back plate tail housing seals that. But the front, hopefully front bearing retainer seals that, but we're gonna make sure that everything is sealed up. Now I'm gonna put my hive on and we'll do that. All right, what I do now to make sure that the hives, don't know for sure if there's any movement of the hives, but I want to make sure that if there is movement, that I have everything in place. The first thing I've got to do before I put a front bearing retainer on is put the little seal cover, seal plate over the front of your cluster, end of your front of your cluster. And I like to do that at this point in time. And I silicone around the area on the front where this thing seals in. And the good thing about this is if you do have a leak with this, you can take it out, reseal it, and put it back in. But I can wipe away any excess that I have after I put this seal cover, this front cover in. I want to make sure that I don't cover up my little drain hole. That is for the oil in the front right there, and I want to make sure I don't cover it up. All right, now I can put my little seal plate in. Trying to cover up my little oil hole right there. Okay. Okay. Now, once I get that in place, I can put the nuts around where we pull the case hives together. And when I do this, all I'm going to do is snug these up so that I can get my mid plate and tail housing on before I do any tightening, because this is part of the alignment, is to get something on the front and something on the back. Then I can torque the side together, the hive together. Then I can come back and tighten up the tail housing to the case to make sure that everything is in alignment and everything is straight. And this is kind of the way I've been doing it. All right, we're putting in the rest of our bolts on the case hive. I'm siliconing the bolts because whether or not these go to fluid or not, I want to make sure that they don't back out. And I want to make sure that if any fluid does get to the bolt threads, that it doesn't come out and cause a leak that we really can't determine where it's coming from. But this will ensure that we don't have any leaks after we get done. This is also the center support bolt, and it does go to fluid, and we want to silicone it and make sure that it is sealed up also. Now I'm going to run these in, and just as I said, all of these right now are just snug. They're not tight, they're snug. Then we'll come back and we'll put the retainer on the front and snug it. Then we'll put the mid-plate tail housing on and then snug it. Then we'll come back and torque the main case and then torque the tail housing. All right, I've got all my bolts snugged down, and like I say, they're just snug. This is the center support bolt, just finished it. And as I look around the trans, I can see the silicone squeezing out, and that's what I want to see, is a ribbon of silicone around, all the way around it, where it's got a good seal, and we really haven't tightened the bolts completely yet. So I can see that we're getting a good seal all the way around. And now we're going to put the front bearing retainer on, just as I said, to make sure, and we're not going to put it on permanently. I'm just going to put it on to make sure that this pulls the hives to where that it is even on the front and rear. And I'll snug this, then we'll go to the rear and do the mid plate and the tail housing. But like I said, all I'm going to do is just snug this in place, and then we'll go to the rear.